Shabbat Shalom. In this week's Parsha, both Abraham and Sarah breathed their last breaths, reached the end of their long and significant lives. Yet, most of this week's Parsha is taken up by the story of the mission of Abraham's servant to find a wife for Isaac. The servant traditionally known as Eliezer, though he is unnamed in our Parsha. Remarkably, the story is narrated and then retold from Eliezer's perspective. It's remarkable because this is an unheard of amount of biblical real estate that is taken up by the telling and then retelling of the story. We have, of course, multiple creation stories in the Bible, and there are biblical motifs that get repeated, such as the sister-wife narratives in Genesis. But I can't think of another instance in which we hear a detailed retelling of a story from a different character's perspective, let alone the perspective of an unnamed servant. The Bible tends to be incredibly terse. Why then do we have a telling and then a retelling? There are several ways to approach this question. Today, I want to suggest that this slice of Torah invites us to pay attention to the act of storytelling. Storytelling as communication, as ritual, as transmission of legacy. Not only our stories, but how we tell our stories matters. Equally important is our audience, who we tell our stories to. My paternal grandmother, Helen, was a particularly powerful storyteller. As an adult reflecting on our time spent at the kitchen table, in long moments where time seemed frozen, I ask myself today, what was my grandmother's intended message to her audience, me, her American granddaughter? Helen, Henny, came to the U.S. at age 7 in between the wars. She had many stories about her childhood in Poland. There were tales of terror, the pogroms that tore through her town. But there were also tales of whimsy, of her falling asleep in a basket of plums in her family's orchard. There were tales of the ship crossing, how she cried when her mother shaved off her beautiful blonde hair to prevent lice, and how the sailors would play ball with the children on the deck of the ship. But there was one story that was my grandmother's central story. It was the story that her life hinged on. It was the story that defined her. This story repeated. It took up a lot of space over the kitchen table. And that was the story of losing her husband, Julius. The story began with their meeting as teenagers. He gave her a ring and asked her to go study. He was the love of my life, she would say. At the pinnacle of the story, my grandfather was an athlete and a young father swimming in the ocean at Brighton Beach and riding his bicycle over the Manhattan Bridge to his job in the jewelry business. One day, he fell off his bicycle, and soon after that, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and soon after that, he was dead, leaving her alone to care for 2 young children. Helen did not know how to drive. She'd never held a job. Suddenly, she had to figure it out all on her own. I can see myself sitting at the kitchen table across from my grandmother, enthralled in her story, though I had heard it so many times before. Suddenly, she had to figure it out all on her own. This was the ikar, the essence of the story she intended to deliver to me. You could lose the person or the people that you love at any moment. You need to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. My grandmother seemed to be telling this story with her life over and over again. It was her ikar. Back to Eliezer. What is the ikar or essence of his story? What can we learn about his retelling of the tale from his perspective? The Bible gives us some sense of the urgency and the importance of the act of storytelling in Genesis 24:33. We didn't actually read this part because we were in the triennial cycle today. But in this part, food is placed before Eliezer, and he says he will not eat until he can tell his story. And I can see the food getting cold as he goes on and on and on. The details are almost exactly the same, but not quite. In Eliezer's retelling, the narrative is reshaped slightly to deliver the message that Rebekah leaving with him to marry Isaac is divinely ordained. It's a foregone conclusion. The ikar, the essence of Eliezer's story, is that God is working through him. He needs Rebekah's family to understand that they are playing a role in a divine plan that reaches beyond all of them. Rashbam said of this part of the Torah, Eliezer's very detailed speech was designed to impress his listeners with how God had been the principal factor in everything which transpired at the well. Radak says Eliezer told them that of all that had gone on between himself and his master Abraham, his transactions with Rebekah, and that God had providentally arranged matters just as Abraham had promised. His emphasis on this point was to impress that they had no alternative. They could not stop the girl from accepting the marriage offer since the matter was from God. Rabbi Josh Fagelson compares storytelling like this to the game of telephone. The conditions of human communication, he says, lend themselves to alteration, degradation, adaptation, magnification, elaboration. This is how we tell stories. Storytelling is, of course, a central feature of Judaism. We're commanded to teach our children the central story of our journey from slavery to freedom, the Exodus narrative. Spot Emmett said that the exodus from constriction actually happens by means of telling the story. This, he said, is the power of the mouth. By means of bringing forth words out of our mouths, we uncover hidden meanings and arrive at revelation. By telling our stories, then, we effect liberation from our own personal Mitzrayim, our own personal constricted places. The more we tell our story, the deeper we go into awareness of the fact that actually it's just a story. And the more that we can come to appreciate the many different ways that we can narrate our lives, says Rabbi Fagelson. Appreciating the fluid nature of stories is an important mechanism for healing. I know as a therapist, I've been trained to work in stories and metaphors because our minds are trained for stories. Storytelling is actually good for us and actually even for our bodies. For example, researchers have found that listening to stories modulates our physiological responses, particularly for children in the ICU. When we listen to another person's story, we enter into their world and we can see things through their eyes. This is particularly powerful for children, hearing stories from adult caregivers. We can transform trauma and make meaning out of our lives through the act of storytelling. Researchers and therapists have even developed a psychotherapeutic treatment, narrative therapy, that harnesses the power of storytelling for healing. In our Parshat, the Bible asks us to consider the story from the perspective of someone who is marginal, a servant, not a patriarch or a matriarch, yet he plays a key role. It makes me think about the musical Hamilton, which transformed the story of the birth of our country for my children, for a generation of Americans. The musical's closing number begins with the voices of the presidents, Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. Every other founding father's story gets told. Every other founding father gets to grow old. And when you're gone, who remembers your name? Who keeps the flame? Who tells your story? And yet it culminates in the lone voice of Eliza, the matriarch who has been on the margins. She sings, I put myself back in the narrative. I stop wasting time on tears. I live another 50 years. I interview every soldier who fought by your side. I try to make sense of your 1,000 pages of writing. Eliza raises funds for the Washington Monument. She founds an orphanage in New York City. She tells the stories of the revolution, the founding of the country, of Alexander Hamilton. What Lin-Manuel Miranda taught us, I think his ikar, is to listen to the voices of those whose stories have been buried or forgotten. What happens when we move the voices from the edges, from the margins, into the center? In our Wednesday morning Parshat class, we asked the question, who is the hero of this story? And some of us argued it's Rebecca. And some of us believed it is Isaac, and others perhaps Eliezer. And then we thought, maybe the hero is God, working behind the scenes to connect the threads of the tapestry of our family, of our legacy. You might say that Eliezer's narrative takes God from the margins and places God at the center of the story. It's an invitation to us right now, today. What happens when we put God, the great mystery, the source of our being, at the center of our story? Shabbat Shalom.